So I know you've had several mystical experiences, and I know one goes back to the passing of your husband. So tell us about that incident.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked before about how grief can be our greatest spiritual teacher, our greatest spiritual awakening. And back in 1980, I was 29 years old. I was married to a beautiful young man who was a mountain climber alongside of me. We were both outward bound instructors back in the 70s. And what that means is we were basically life coaches teaching people to overcome their fear, but we were doing it in nature, in the outdoors. And we kind of felt invincible, we were climbing 14ers in Colorado and everything. And he had some stomach problems, and he was finally diagnosed correctly. And when they did diagnose him, they told us he had colon cancer. He was 32, and he died a year later in my arms after suffering terribly for a year. But the last few months and the way he died was a complete shared death experience for me, which means that I was going on the journey with him. And we had mystical experiences before he crossed, like he was singing Lakota songs because we had been to see a Native American healer who actually taught him in spirit Lakota healing songs. And he would wake up singing those, and the doctors were so confused, like, what language is that? And I had
Mm,
heard Lakota, and I knew that that's what he was singing. And he would say, Chief Fool's Crow came back to see me in my dreams. And he gave me two songs. One song was to help me die, and one song was to relieve the pain. And then when he crossed, he had told me specifically he did not want to die in the hospital and that he wanted to die at home because I was caring for him at home. And he said, and I want to die in your arms. And
mm,
I had made him that promise a million times, And unfortunately, there was a medical emergency, and the hospice nurse said, you don't want him to die this way. We have to get him to the hospital and stop the bleeding, and then you can bring him back home.
mm.
But things get out of control as things wind down, often when we're headed towards the exit point. But I also believe there's a reason for however it goes. And suddenly we ended up in the hospital, and he ended up in a hospital room in a coma. And he had always said, I don't want to be in a coma. And he was terrified that that meant his spirit would be trapped. And I kind of was afraid of that too. I mean, this was 1979, I was pretty much an idiot at that point in my life. So, what happened was he showed me in the final hours that he wasn't trapped in his body. I fell asleep on the floor of the hospital room. I was so exhausted. He'd been in this coma for a couple days. I felt so guilty. I couldn't get him home. All of his friends had arrived. They were sitting in the hospital room with us.
Mhm.
And I finally fell asleep on the floor, and he instantly appeared vividly in front of me and said, I mean, I still remember it so clearly. It was such a vision. And he looked healthy. And he said, what are you doing on the floor? I am not trapped in that body. Get up and come over to the bed and hold me so I can cross over the way we talked about in your arms. And I just jolted awake. And I went, oh my gosh, you guys, he's ready to cross. He's not trapped in that body. And I kicked everybody out of the room except for his mother. And his mother and I stood on either side of him. And we just started rubbing his body and saying, we love you. We let you go. We're going to be okay. Instantly, Brian, he took one long, peaceful breath, and
Mm.
his soul left his body in such a visible, palpable way that his mother and I both saw it, witnessed it as his
Oh, wow.
soul left his body. And we both looked down at the body and just knew that was an empty shell now. And that was kind of the beginning of a 3 to 4 week out of body experience for me, where Paul was taking me with him into the divine and showing me about divine order. And Brian, I was in my 20s. I really didn't believe in any kind of a divine order. I saw people suffering. that certainly didn't feel like divine order. And yet he was showing me, he would say, everything that happens on earth in the physical world has a purpose to it, and it's a purpose for higher good. It takes the world to a better place of love and compassion and understanding. And
Hmm.
like if I dropped something, he would say in my head, he'd say, that's on purpose. You're not supposed to take that vitamin or something, whatever I had dropped. And I had this constant dialogue with him, with me for about 3 weeks. And that's known as a shared death experience. And I was very exalted, like I was feeling no grief, no pain. I could hardly eat. And it was not what people expected of me after Paul died. And I was just in an exalted state. And then, of course, we all have to crash and come back into the body and experience grief, which of course happened. But for about 3 weeks, I had a mystical teacher showing me what physical life is really about.
Wow. So this was, you said 1979, 1980. Had you heard the term shared death experience?
No,
What
no,
was your
no. In
thought
fact,
about what was going on here?
I know. I didn't hear about that term until, gosh, it was like 2014, right around the time I had this vision. Raymond Moody was talking about it, I think. And anyway, so back then, what I thought was, um, I honestly thought, boy, I'm pretty weird and I've got to figure out a way to be more normal because here I am turning 30 and I don't know how to make a living and my husband just died and I got to get very grounded in this
Hmm.
physical world. And so I would tell people about that death experience and they were all astounded like, wow, that's amazing, but it wasn't even a possibility in my mind that I would make my living talking about these things or even sharing numerology.
Mhm.
Whereas numerology happened right when Paul died. A friend gave me a numerology reading, and that also really showed me what soul agreements are and soul paths and soul missions. But my focus became, how do I now make a living here in this physical world? And I used everything in my toolbox to figure that out and became a professional writer for many years. I wrote about health because I was trying to help people avoid cancer. I
Mhm.
became a pretty well-respected health writer until it was time for my next reinvention.
Yeah, right, right.